This happened about 6 years ago. At the time, I worked in a small accounting office with 7 people. We all knew each other well enough to chat during lunch, but outside of work, we weren't exactly friends. One Monday morning, one of my coworkers, Jason, came in looking exhausted. He told us his father had passed away over the weekend. We all signed a sympathy card, collected money for flowers, and he thanked everyone before taking the rest of the week off. On Friday, another coworker asked if anyone wanted to attend the funeral. I didn't know Jason very well, but I figured it was the respectful thing to do. The funeral home was about 40 minutes away in a small town I'd never been to before. It was an old brick building with a gravel parking lot. There were maybe 30 cars outside. As we walked in, I immediately started looking for Jason. I couldn't find him. I assumed he was in a private room with family, so I took a seat near the back. A few minutes later, the service began. The minister welcomed everyone, thanked them for coming, then paused while looking down at his notes. "I know one of you never met Arthur," he said. He looked up. For just a second, he looked directly at me. Then he carried on like nothing had happened. It made me uncomfortable, but I convinced myself I was reading too much into it. People started sharing stories about the man who had died. One woman said Arthur always believed strangers crossed your path for a reason. Another man laughed and said Arthur used to tell people that some visitors arrived exactly when they were supposed to. Everyone else smiled. I didn't. Something about the way they kept glancing in my direction started making me feel like I shouldn't be there. When the service ended, everyone slowly made their way outside. I still hadn't seen Jason. I asked the coworker I'd driven with if she'd seen him. She looked confused. "I thought he was with you." We checked outside. Nothing. His car wasn't there. I called him straight to voicemail. Feeling embarrassed, I went back inside and looked at the memorial display near the entrance. The name wasn't Jason's father. It was Arthur Hale. I walked to the reception desk and apologized. "I think we accidentally attended the wrong funeral." The receptionist frowned. "Who were you here for?" I opened my mouth to answer, and realized I didn't know. No one had actually invited me. I'd simply followed my coworker inside without checking the name. The receptionist kept staring at me. Then she quietly asked, "Did someone tell you to come here?" I couldn't answer, because nobody had. The drive there suddenly felt like a blur. I couldn't remember leaving home. I couldn't remember the route. I couldn't even remember parking the car. My coworker admitted she couldn't remember the drive either. We left immediately. The following Monday, Jason returned to work. I told him I was sorry we'd missed his father's funeral. He looked confused. Then he said, "I never told anyone where it was." I asked him which funeral home they used. He gave me the name. It wasn't the one we'd gone to. A week later, I drove back to the funeral home. The same woman was working at reception. I asked if they had any records for Arthur Hale. She searched for a few minutes. Then she shook her head. "We've never had anyone by that name." I reminded her that I'd attended the service myself. She looked at me with a puzzled expression. "I'm sorry. We weren't open that day. I've never been able to explain what happened. I know where I went. I remember sitting through the service. I remember hearing people speak. I remember everyone looking at me, but according to the funeral home, there was never a funeral. Sometimes I wonder if I really walked into the wrong service, or if I was the only person there who wasn't supposed to be." This happened about 4 years ago when I was working for a small printing company. There were only 5 people in our office. My boss, Mark, 2 other employees, the receptionist, and me. It was a pretty boring job. Most days were spent answering emails, checking orders, and waiting for something to go wrong with one of the printers. Mark was the kind of boss who was always around. He'd eat lunch at his desk, complain about the coffee, and spend most afternoons walking between our offices asking what everyone was working on. One Wednesday, around 12:30, Mark stood up and said he was going out for lunch. He grabbed his keys and told us he'd be back in about 20 minutes. Nobody thought anything of it. About 20 minutes later, I heard the front door open. I looked up from my computer. Mark walked past my desk. He didn't say anything. He just went into his office and closed the door. I remember thinking that was strange because Mark never came back from lunch without saying something. Usually he'd walk in complaining about traffic or asking if anyone wanted coffee. A few minutes later, I heard his chair move around in his office, then the sound of his computer turning on. I didn't think much of it. About an hour later, I needed a document from him. I knocked on his door, no answer. I knocked again, still nothing. I opened the door slightly. Mark was sitting behind his desk, facing his computer. Mark, he didn't respond. I could see the back of his head, but he wasn't moving. I assumed he was on a phone call, so I closed the door. At around 4:30, I walked past his office again. He was still sitting there, same position, same posture. I thought it was odd, but I didn't want to bother him. At 5, everyone started packing up. As I was leaving, I glanced through the glass panel beside his office door. Mark was still sitting at his desk. I remember thinking, that guy really works too much. The next morning, I arrived around 8. The receptionist was already there. She looked nervous. She asked if I'd spoken to Mark after lunch the day before. I said yes. She stared at me. "What do you mean, yes?" I told her he'd come back from lunch around 1. She shook her head. "He never came back." I laughed because I thought she was messing with me. Then she told me the police had called the office that morning. Mark had been killed in a car accident. The accident happened at approximately 12:47 p.m., less than 20 minutes after he'd left the office. I remember feeling sick. I told her that couldn't be right. I'd seen him come back. I'd watched him walk into his office. I'd heard his computer turn on. She just stared at me. The police came to the office later that morning. They asked me to describe exactly what I'd seen. I told them everything. The strange thing was that neither of the other employees had seen Mark return, only me. They also checked the building's security camera. There was footage of Mark leaving at 12:34. There was no footage of him coming back. At first, they thought the camera had malfunctioned. It hadn't. It recorded everyone else entering and leaving normally. Then one of the officers asked me something I hadn't considered. "Did you actually see his face?" I thought about it. I'd seen him walk past me, but his head had been slightly lowered. When I'd looked into his office, I had only seen the back of his head. I couldn't remember seeing his face at all. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the office. About him sitting at his desk. The next morning, I went back. Mark's office had been sealed. I stood outside the door for a while. Then I noticed something on the floor, a receipt. It was from the restaurant Mark had supposedly gone to for lunch. The time printed on it was 12:39 p.m. I showed it to the police. They checked the restaurant's cameras. Mark had never gone inside. The receipt had been paid for in cash. They couldn't determine who bought it. I quit 2 weeks later. I still don't know what I saw that afternoon, but there's one thing that bothers me more than anything else. For years, I remembered Mark walking past my desk after lunch. I remembered his shirt, his watch, his shoes. But I couldn't remember his face, not once, and sometimes I wonder, if I had looked up when he walked past me, would I have recognized the person wearing his clothes? This happened about 5 years ago when I was working late shifts at a small hotel. One night, I finished work around 1 a.m. and went to the parking lot to get my car. As I was walking toward it, I noticed a man standing near the entrance. He looked to be in his 50s, wearing a dark jacket and holding a small paper bag. I assumed he was waiting for someone. As I walked past him, he looked at me and said, "You're late." I stopped. I thought maybe he had mistaken me for someone else. I told him he had the wrong person. He smiled and said, "No, you're the one." It was strange, but I didn't feel threatened. I just figured he was drunk or confused. I got into my car and drove home. The next morning, I mentioned it to one of my coworkers. She asked me what the man looked like. I described him. She went quiet. Then she asked me what time I'd seen him. I told her. She said, "That's impossible." I laughed and asked why. She told me the hotel had closed its front entrance at midnight because the night manager had been having trouble with people hanging around outside. Nobody was supposed to be there. I didn't think much of it until later that afternoon. One of the other employees came into the office carrying a box of old photographs. She was looking for pictures from a staff event. As she went through them, she stopped. Then she called me over. There was a photograph of the hotel's employees standing outside the building. It had been taken almost 20 years earlier. I recognized the man immediately. Same face, same dark jacket, same expression. I asked who he was. My coworker said that was Daniel. He was the night manager. I looked at the picture again. Then I noticed the date. Daniel had died in a car accident 20 years earlier. I asked my coworker if she was sure. She said yes. Then she pointed at the paper bag he was holding in the photograph. It was the exact same kind of brown paper bag I'd seen in his hand the night before. I didn't tell anyone what happened after that. I quit the hotel a few months later, but there's one thing I still think about. The man hadn't asked me for directions. He hadn't asked who I was. He'd simply looked at me and said, "You're late." I've often wondered what I was late for. Because whatever he was waiting for, he seemed completely certain I was supposed to arrive.